Hey guys, good morning or good afternoon whenever you're watching this video. We're going to be talking about a new unit this week. We're kind of starting 11th grade history after our review last week. We're going to be looking at American society in transition this week, this period after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. America is on the move in the late 19th century. People are moving, money is moving, life is changing drastically, and we're going to look at three major categories of change that are happening during this time period. We're going to look at social change, and then economic changes that are happening, and then political changes that are happening. So let's start with our first question for the week, which is what social changes were taking place during the late 19th century? And if you're taking notes in any way that you would like with a thinking map or any kind of notes, this is the guiding question we're going to be looking at today. The social changes. What's happening with the people in America during this late 19th century time period? So just to put it into context, the American Civil War is fought from 1861 to 1865, and that war is devastating. Over 600,000 Americans are dead. Countless others are injured. The economy in the South is destroyed. Buildings all over the country are destroyed, mostly in the South, and so we have this enormous task of putting the country back together again, a period we call Reconstruction. And the issues we're facing in Reconstruction are monumental. How do we bring those former Confederate states, the rebelling states, how do we bring them back into the United States? How can we get the Southern economy to recover now that slavery is abolished, their main source of labor? Speaking of slavery, what do we do about almost 4 million people who used to be slaves and now are free, and they are black and they're not seen as equal human beings? How do we bring them into American society? So these are monumental things that we're trying to accomplish in this time period of Reconstruction. It's not going to be easy, especially for those freed African Americans. Now, during this time, for the past 100 years, we've been going through what we're going to call the first industrial revolution. That's the one we talked about in 8th grade that was all about textile mills and factories and steam power and steamboats and railroads. But the industrial revolution keeps going, and we really categorize it in two different revolutions. The first revolution we talked about in 8th grade, and now this second revolution, the second industrial revolution, that is continuing to change American society in the late 19th century. We have bigger factories, more power, more technology, bigger railroads. And so let's look at the first answer to our question here. What social changes were taking place during the late 19th century? The first change is industrialization. It's a shift from an agrarian society. Agrarian just means farming, mostly farming. The shift from agrarian society economy to an industrial economy. People are moving from working on farms to working in factories in large numbers. Now, you would still say that right after the Civil War, most people are still living on farms, but there is a growing population moving to work in factories in that setting. Now, there are some big businesses that are causing this shift. The railroad business is one of the largest. Guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt and other railroad tycoons are building huge businesses because railroads are the primary way that we move products and people during this time. It's the fastest way to move on land. So we're laying thousands of miles of railroad tracks. This is a map in 1890. By 1890, we have railroad tracks all over the country. And this has really just been happening for about 50 years. So in 50 years, we've laid thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of these Twizzler-looking railroad tracks all over the country. Now, because we're laying railroad tracks, we need steel for those tracks. So the steel business is becoming a major business during this time. We're also going to be using more and more coal and oil to power our machines and to power eventually our cars and planes in the future. So oil is becoming a booming business during this time period. So industrialization is that first change. The second change that's happening because of industrialization is urbanization. You'll remember this from 8th grade, that people are moving from the countryside to live in cities. It's not just that they're working in factories, but they're also where they live is changing. Instead of living out in the open in the countryside, they're now living in cities. And you can see, you might want to pause this video actually and look at these numbers. Let me get my little pointer here. We can see these enormous changes that from 1860 to 1920, right? Not only does the population get much bigger, but there are more people by 1920 living in urban areas than there are in rural areas, which was unheard of before this time period. If you go back even further to 1860, you would have pretty much less than 5% of the population living in urban areas. So that's a huge shift, that people are moving from farms into cities. And so we have these major U.S. cities appearing for the first time, and their populations are doubling and tripling because of industrialization. And so when you go live in a city, obviously people are pretty much stacked on top of each other. So people who used to live on farms and out in the open in the countryside now live in these tiny little apartments that we call tenements. Small apartments that are often, very often, overcrowded, sometimes with multiple families. Sometimes you'll have your grandparents and your parents and all their kids living in the same household. Sometimes both sets of grandparents stacked on top of each other in these tiny little apartment buildings. Here we are, more families, overcrowding, congestion, and that's going to lead to its own set of problems. We're going to have in these cities unsanitary conditions, and diseases are going to break out because we're changing so fast and we don't have the procedures and the policies to make sure that disease does not spread, to make sure that our streets are clean. Because remember, at this time there's not a really good sewage system. So a lot of the human waste, when people go to the bathroom, they're just dumping it into the streets because they don't have a good sewage system in these cities. They haven't developed that yet. They will eventually. But at this point, this is what life in these cities looks like. There's also a lot of crime and social tension. Anytime you put a lot of people in a small area, that's what's going to happen. You're going to see a lot of crime. The third change happening during the late 19th century is immigration. European immigrants are flooding into the United States. Why? It's very simple. There are jobs available. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, these are new immigrants. There are the old immigrants from the early 19th century that were mostly from the British Isles and Germany. These new immigrants are coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. So think like Russia, the Baltic states, and Southern Europe like Italy or Croatia, those areas. Croatia didn't exist back then, but those areas that we know today, that's where they're coming from. And this map kind of shows that. You can pause the video again and look more closely at this, but we see on the left side, it's mostly British and Irish immigrants and Germans, so mostly Northern Europeans between 1860 and 1900, but later on it's going to be mostly Italian and Southern Europe and Eastern Europe immigrants coming in. So these are the new immigrants coming into the United States. Now, what's pushing them out of Europe? Overcrowding. Europe is overcrowded. Now, we just talked about how America is becoming more overcrowded, but there's a lot more room in the United States. There's also a lot of political instability in Europe, and religious persecution is pushing them out. What's pulling them in? Quite simply, economic opportunity. The American dream, that you can come to America and start from nothing and make something of yourself. Because of our economic system of free enterprise, that's possible. In Europe, if you're born poor, you're probably going to die poor. That's just the way it is back then. There's also a lot more political and religious freedom in the United States at this time, and just the opportunity for a new life is going to be attractive to a lot of people. Now, because of this rise in immigration, all these immigrants coming in, just like today, not everyone is super excited about immigrants coming in and bringing their families and their cultures and their way of life into the United States. They have to work, so they're going to take a lot of jobs. So we're going to see Americans who already live in the United States, who, by the way, are descendants of immigrants. They're going to start calling themselves Native Americans, which is so ironic. And we're going to see the rise of what's called nativism. This is this idea that Americans are going to look at immigrants as this other group of people who are coming in and taking jobs and taking their way of life and changing America in a way that is not desirable. And we can identify with this today. I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States in 2020 who see immigrants and immigration in this way. There's also going to be, a lot of discrimination and looking down on immigrants going on. There's going to be an anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. There are a lot of Catholics coming in from Italy, and a lot of Americans are worried with all these Catholics coming in, the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, might have more power in the United States. And a lot of Americans don't want that to happen. So we start to see all this racism and nativism and discrimination happening in the United States. In hiring processes and in giving homes to people, there's going to be a lot of discrimination happening between natives and immigrants. Even though, again, those natives are descendants of British and Irish and German immigrants from former generations. So it's kind of ironic. It's the same issue as today. Who was here first? We're also going to see the Chinese really get the brunt of this discrimination. And this is an offensive cartoon on this page here that depicts the Chinese in a racist, discriminatory way. But the United States passed in 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act that banned Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. That's kind of the culmination of all those racist policies. This is banning any immigrants from China. We've seen this happen just in our lifetime, where our president has banned immigrants from certain parts of the world, and that's caused a lot of debate. And then finally, you see the rise of ideas like social Darwinism. If you remember, Darwinism is this idea that of evolution, survival of the fittest, that over time, over millions of years, the animals that were able to adapt, the creatures that were able to adapt and evolve over time and survive, are the ones that we have today. Well, some people believe in social Darwinism that the same is true of human beings, that those who are stronger and more intelligent will eventually survive. Now, for a lot of people in this time period, those stronger, more intelligent people were white people. That's how they believed. That's how they saw it. And they looked down on people from South America and Central America and even Europeans, and looked down, of course, on people of African descent. And that's why we still see, racial tension, ethnic tension in our country today because of ideas like social Darwinism. We also see this idea of Americanization. We don't want the Americans back then don't want the immigrants coming in and bringing their culture and creating a big melting pot. What they want is for these immigrants to come in and become American, right? Learn the Pledge of Allegiance, learn English, and become Americans, and kind of forget their heritage and their culture and leave that behind. So this is what's going on with the American people in the late 19th century. You have industrialization, people are moving into factory jobs, urbanization, people are moving from farms into cities. We have a huge degree of immigration going on in the late 19th century. And some of the effects are very positive, but a lot of the effects are very negative. A lot of tension, crime, racism, all the effects we saw here, unsanitary conditions, working conditions are terrible. And that's going to be something we're going to have to wrestle with in American history in the time period that comes after all this change.